The water stretched endlessly under the fog, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple as a fish leapt silently into the air. The morning was quiet, too quiet for a place usually bustling with early risers jogging along the lake's edge or kayaking across the calm water. Two fishermen, Hank and Roy, had been out since dawn. Hank was an old-timer, his weathered face telling the story of 1,000 mornings spent on the lake. Roy, his younger companion, was a recent transplant to the town, eager to bond over the traditions of small-town life. The two men sat in their small wooden boat, their rods cast into the water. They spoke in low murmurs, the kind of easy conversation that came from years of friendship, or in Roy's case, a desperate attempt to belong. "You ever wonder what's down there?" Roy asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. Hank chuckled, his gruff voice tinged with amusement. "Nothing but fish and secrets, boy. That lake's been here longer than any of us. Holds more stories than we'll ever know." It was then that Roy noticed something unusual, a dark shape bobbing in the water, partially submerged. He squinted, leaning forward. "What the hell is that?" Hank turned, his easy demeanor replaced by a sharp focus. "Looks like a suitcase." The two men paddled closer, the boat creaking under their movements. As they reached the floating object, an unease settled over them. Hank hooked the edge of the suitcase with his fishing pole and carefully dragged it into the boat. It was heavy, too heavy for its size. Water dripped from its edges, pooling at their feet. "Should we open it?" Roy's voice wavered. Hank hesitated. "We don't have much of a choice, do we?" The suitcase's latch was rusted but gave way with a metallic snap. What they saw inside made Roy recoil, nearly tipping the boat. Hank, for all his years and hardened experiences, was silent, his face pale. Inside was the body of a man, curled unnaturally to fit the suitcase. His skin was pale, his eyes lifeless. Bruises marred his face, and his hands were bound with duct tape. Hank covered his mouth, the smell of decay hitting him like a wave. "God help us," he whispered. Roy reached for his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed the police. The lake, once a place of peace and tradition, had become the stage for a horror they couldn't yet comprehend. The water of Rough River Lake was serene that morning, a deceptive calm that hid a horrifying secret. Two fishermen drifted in silence, unaware that their lives were about to be forever scarred. Richie Phillips was the kind of person who didn't just walk into a room, he filled it. His laugh, loud and contagious, often rang out above the hum of the small-town diner where he worked. Customers adored him. He had a knack for remembering orders, birthdays, and even the tiniest details about people's lives. It was these little things that made him unforgettable. Richie, called Mrs. Carter, an elderly regular who came in every Thursday for coffee and pie. "You're the only reason I leave my house some days." Richie grinned as he placed her order on the table. "Well, Mrs. Carter, I'm just making sure you don't miss out on the world's best pie. Don't tell me I'm the only one keeping you coming back." Mrs. Carter chuckled, her eyes twinkling. "The pie's good, but it's you who's the real treat." But Richie's light wasn't just confined to the diner. At night, he transformed into a star at the local karaoke bar. His voice, rich and full of emotion, captivated audiences. People came from miles around just to hear him sing. It was his escape, a moment where he could let go of the pressures of small-town life and dream of something bigger. "Someday I'll be on a real stage," Richie confided to his best friend, Carla, as they sat on the hood of his beat-up car, staring at the stars. Carla smiled, her arm looped around his. "You will, but don't forget us little people when you're famous, okay?" Richie's face grew serious. "I could never forget you. This town, as much as I want to leave, it's still home. You're still my family." But behind Richie's charm and dreams was a quiet sadness, a loneliness he rarely let show. Being a gay man in a conservative town wasn't easy. While he had a close-knit group of friends who loved and supported him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was constantly walking on eggshells, careful not to upset the delicate balance of acceptance he'd carved out. His journal, kept hidden under his bed, was a testament to his inner thoughts. Page after page detailed his hopes, fears, and a yearning for love. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm too much," he wrote one night. the rain tapping softly against his window. Too loud, too hopeful, too trusting. But then I think, maybe the world isn't enough for people like me. Richie's trust, his unwavering belief in the goodness of people, was both his greatest strength and his fatal flaw. Richie Phillips was a man of light in a world often filled with shadows. He dreamed of a life where he could be himself without fear. But he didn't know that his kindness would one day lead him into the hands of a killer. It was a rainy night in Elizabethtown, the kind that made the streets gleam under the dim glow of streetlights. Richie had just finished his shift at the diner, his feet aching but his spirits high after sharing a laugh with Carla on the way out. He pulled into the gas station to fill up his car, the rain pattering against his windshield as he stepped out, umbrella in hand. It was here that Richie met Joshua Cottrell. Joshua, with his lean frame and piercing eyes, sat on the curb under the flickering fluorescent lights, his hoodie soaked and his face shadowed. He looked lost, vulnerable. Even in Richie's kind heart couldn't ignore him. "You all right, man?" Richie asked, crouching slightly to meet Joshua's eyes. Joshua glanced up, his face unreadable. "Yeah, just waiting for a ride, or something." Richie tilted his head, unconvinced. "You sure? You look like you've been out here a while." The two exchanged a few more words, Richie offering a warm smile as he extended his hand. Joshua hesitated before shaking it, his grip firm but fleeting. Richie couldn't explain it, but there was something about Joshua that didn't quite him, a quiet intensity, a brokenness that Richie felt drawn to. "Hey, I'm just heading home after a long shift. If you need a warm place to crash, my couch is open," Richie said, gesturing toward his car. Joshua hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Why are you being so nice to me? You don't even know me." Richie shrugged, his smile softening. "Because I've been there. And sometimes all it takes is one person to make things a little easier." Joshua finally stood, towering slightly over Richie. "All right, thanks. I guess." What Richie couldn't see in that moment was the glint of calculation in Joshua's eyes, the gears turning in his mind. This wasn't a chance encounter, not entirely. Joshua had seen Richie before, watched him from afar at the diner, piecing together details about the man everyone seemed to adore. And now, with Richie extending his trust, Joshua saw an opportunity. As they drove through the rain-soaked streets, Richie filled the silence with lighthearted chatter, talking about his love for karaoke and his dream of performing on a big stage someday. Joshua nodded along, his responses curt but polite. "Maybe one day you'll see me on TV," Richie joked, flashing a grin. Joshua's lips twitched into a brief smile, but his thoughts were elsewhere. "Yeah, maybe." Richie's kindness was his defining trait, but sometimes kindness can be a double-edged sword. On that rainy night, he opened his life to a man who would repay his generosity with unthinkable cruelty. Richie's apartment was small but cozy, adorned with mismatched furniture and walls covered in pictures of friends and family. It was a space that radiated warmth, much like Richie himself. Joshua sat stiffly on the couch, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the details of Richie's life. "You hungry?" "I've got leftovers from the diner," Richie offered, heading toward the kitchen. Joshua shook his head. "I'm good," Richie shrugged, returning with 2 beers instead. He handed one to Joshua, who took it reluctantly. For a while, the two sat in silence, the clinking of their beer bottles against the coffee table the only sound. "So, what's your story?" Richie asked, his tone light but curious. Joshua hesitated, his grip tightening around the bottle. "Not much to tell. Just trying to figure things out." Richie nodded, respecting his boundaries. "Fair enough. If you ever want to talk, I'm a pretty good listener." The tension in the room was subtle at first, like a faint crack in a foundation. But as the night wore on, it grew. Joshua's responses became shorter, his demeanor colder. Richie noticed but chalked it up to exhaustion or nerves. "Hey, if you're tired, you can crash here. I'll grab you some blankets," Richie offered, standing up. It happened so quickly that Richie didn't see it coming. One moment he was walking toward the closet, and the next, Joshua was behind him, shoving him against the wall. "Ooh, what the hell?" Richie exclaimed, his voice a mix of confusion and alarm. Joshua's face was twisted with anger, his voice low and venomous. "Don't play dumb with me. I know what you're trying to do." Richie's heart raced as he tried to defuse the situation. "I don't know what you're talking about, man." Just before he could finish, Joshua struck him, the force sending Richie to the floor. The betrayal hit harder than the physical blow. Richie, the man who had shown nothing but kindness, now lay defenseless as Joshua unleashed his pent-up rage. Joshua's accusations of unwanted advances were baseless, a cruel justification for the violence he inflicted. Richie pleaded, tears streaming down his face, but Joshua didn't stop. He bound Richie's hands with duct tape, silencing his cries with another strip across his mouth. The room, once filled with warmth and laughter, was now cold and silent. Richie's life was extinguished that night, his trust repaid with brutality. Richie Phillips, a man who saw the good in everyone, met his end at the hands of someone who saw his kindness as weakness. In his final moments, he was betrayed by the very trust that defined him. The room was silent, except for the sound of Joshua's heavy breathing. He stood over Richie's lifeless body, his mind racing as panic set in. The gravity of what he had done began to sink in, but instead of remorse, there was only a cold, calculated resolve. Joshua scanned the apartment, taking in the photographs on the walls, the laughter frozen in time. For a brief moment, he hesitated, his gaze lingering on a framed picture of Richie and a woman with bright eyes and an infectious smile. His best friend, no doubt. "None of that matters now," Joshua muttered to himself, shaking off the thought. He grabbed a suitcase from Richie's closet, a large, worn bag that had seen better days. He opened it and stared at the body on the floor. It took every ounce of his strength to lift Richie's limp form and force it into the suitcase, bending the limbs unnaturally to make it fit. The sound of duct tape tearing echoed in the still apartment as Joshua wrapped the suitcase tightly, ensuring there was no chance it would come undone. The task was gruesome and slow, the kind of thing that would haunt most people. But Joshua moved with a chilling detachment, his mind focused solely on the next step. Dragging the suitcase down the stairs and out to the car was the hardest part. The weight of it was immense, and every scrape against the steps sent a jolt of fear through him. What if someone saw? What if someone stopped him? But no one did. The streets were quiet, the rain masking the sound of the suitcase scraping against the pavement. He loaded it into the trunk of Richie's car and climbed into the driver's seat, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. The drive to Rough River Lake felt like an eternity. Every pair of headlights made him flinch, every passing car a potential threat. But he made it, pulling into a secluded area near the water's edge. The lake was eerily calm, its surface smooth and unbroken. Joshua dragged the suitcase out of the trunk and down the muddy bank, the weight of it digging grooves into the earth. He paused at the water's edge, staring out at the vast expanse of darkness. For a fleeting moment, he felt something, a pang of guilt, perhaps, or the faintest echo of humanity. But it was gone as quickly as it came. With a grunt, he shoved the suitcase into the water, watching as it floated briefly before sinking beneath the surface. The ripples spread outward, disappearing into the stillness of the lake. Joshua stood there for a long time, the rain washing over him. He lit a cigarette with trembling hands, the glow of the lighter briefly illuminating his face. "It's done," he muttered, tossing the cigarette into the water. But it wasn't done. Not yet. Joshua believed he had erased his crime, that the lake would hold his secret forever. But the dead have a way of rising, and Richie's story was far from over. It wasn't long before Richie's disappearance was noticed. His absence was felt immediately at the diner, where his co-workers exchanged worried glances as the hours turned into days. Carla, his best friend, was the first to raise the alarm, calling the police when Richie didn't respond to her messages. When the suitcase was discovered by the fishermen, the small town of Elizabethtown was thrown into chaos. The news spread like wildfire, the horrific details of Richie's death sending shockwaves through the community. Joshua was arrested within days, thanks to security footage from the gas station and evidence left behind in Richie's apartment. His trial became a media sensation, drawing attention not only from the town but from across the nation. In the courtroom, Joshua sat with an air of indifference, his cold eyes scanning the gallery, as if daring anyone to challenge him. His defense was as shocking as the crime itself, the gay panic defense. He claimed that Richie had made unwanted advances toward him, triggering a violent reaction he couldn't control. The courtroom erupted in outrage. Carla, sitting in the front row, had to be restrained as she shouted, "You're a liar. Richie would never hurt anyone." The prosecutor, a sharp and passionate woman named Angela Hayes, tore into Joshua's defense. "This was not a crime of passion," she declared, pacing in front of the jury. "This was calculated. This was cruel. Richie Phillips didn't die because of who he was, he died because of who Joshua Cottrell is." But the defense continued to play on prejudice and fear, painting Richie as a predator and Joshua as a victim. The trial was grueling, each day filled with testimony that laid bare the worst of human nature. Carla took the stand, her voice breaking as she spoke about her friend. "Richie was the kindest person I've ever known. He didn't deserve this. No one does." The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of their decision pressing heavily on them. In the end, justice was served. Joshua was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. But for Richie's friends and family, the verdict was little comfort. Nothing could bring him back. The trial was a battle not just for justice, but for Richie's memory. In the face of lies and prejudice, the truth prevailed, but at a cost no one should ever have to pay. The courtroom may have delivered a verdict, but for those who loved Richie Phillips, the pain was far from over. His absence left a void that nothing could fill. The diner was quieter now, the hum of conversation tinged with sadness. Richie's favorite table by the window sat empty, as if waiting for him to return. Carla visited the lake often. She would sit on the dock, staring out at the water that had held her friend's body. Sometimes she brought flowers, laying them gently at the edge of the water before sitting in silence. The world had moved on, but Carla couldn't yet. She carried Richie's journal in her bag, reading his words whenever the weight of his loss became unbearable. His dreams, his fears, his longing for love, it was all there, a raw and unfiltered glimpse into his soul. "Sometimes I think people like me aren't meant to be happy," Richie had written in one entry. "But then I look at the people around me, and I feel lucky. Maybe happiness isn't about having everything you want. Maybe it's about loving what you have." Carla clutched the journal tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You deserved so much more," she whispered. The town held a vigil for Richie, the community coming together to honor his life. Candles flickered in the night as people shared stories about the man who had touched so many lives. Mrs. Carter, the elderly diner regular, spoke through tears. "Richie wasn't just my waiter. He was my friend. He made me feel seen when the rest of the world didn't care." As the crowd listened, the weight of Richie's absence was palpable, but so was the love he had left behind. Richie Phillips was more than a victim. He was a son, a friend, a dreamer. His light may have been extinguished, but its warmth remained, carried in the hearts of those who knew him. Richie's murder sparked outrage far beyond the borders of Elizabethtown. His story became a rallying cry for LGBTQ rights, shining a light on the prejudices and dangers that still existed in small-town America. Advocacy groups took up the cause, using Richie's name to push for the abolition of the gay panic defense in courtrooms across the country. Carla threw herself into the fight, channeling her grief into action. She attended rallies, gave interviews, and worked tirelessly to ensure that Richie's death wouldn't be in vain. Her voice became a powerful force, demanding justice not just for Richie, but for all who had suffered under the weight of discrimination. 1 year after Richie's murder, Carla stood on the steps of the state capitol, addressing a crowd of hundreds. "Richie was my best friend," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "He was kind, talented, and full of dreams. But he was taken from us because someone saw his identity as a threat. That is unacceptable. And we will not stop fighting until the world is safe for people like Richie." The crowd erupted in applause. their voices rising in a chant, "Justice for Richie. Justice for all." Laws began to change. In Kentucky, the gay panic defense was banned, the state acknowledging the deep injustice it had allowed for far too long. Other states followed suit, inspired by Richie's story and the tireless efforts of advocates like Carla. Richie's death was a tragedy, but his legacy became a beacon of hope. In his name, a movement grew, one that demanded equality, justice, and the right to live without fear. Years passed, but Richie's memory remained alive. The diner hung the photo of him by the window, a small plaque beneath it reading, "In loving memory of Richie Phillips, a light that will never fade." Carla eventually opened a non-profit organization dedicated to LGBTQ, offering support and resources to those who felt alone or unsafe. She named it Richie's Place, a tribute to her friend's unwavering kindness and generosity. On what would have been Richie's 35th birthday, Carla returned to the lake, this time with a group of friends and supporters. They released lanterns into the sky, their warm glow reflecting on the water's surface. As Carla watched the lanterns drift higher, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Richie was gone, but his spirit lived on in the laughter of the diner, in the voices of the movement he inspired, and in the countless lives he had touched. Richie Phillips may have left this world, but his light endured, casting away the shadows of hate and fear. His story was one of tragedy, but also of hope, resilience, and the power of love to transcend even the darkest of times.